We've previously worked on this concept of a component, and a component having a YAML definition of things like the APIs and the events that it's publishing. And in the first version of our canvas, we had an ingress controller that could look at these API definitions and expose those APIs to the outside world with an ingress. Now, this is not something you'd want to use in a production environment. In a production environment, you'd want some sort of API gateway where you could apply security, throttling, and those sorts of non-functional requirements on top of your API. And so I've been experimenting with an API gateway and the concept of taking these custom resource definitions from a component and applying them into an API gateway. Now, I've chosen to use an API gateway called WSO2 because WSO2 has already begun to implement this sort of Kubernetes operator approach to managing its own API gateway. And if you look into the WSO2 GitHub repository, there's an instructions on how to install WSO2 and how to install this API operator for Kubernetes. And effectively, this API operator for Kubernetes already uses the Kubernetes approach and custom resource definitions and having a controller to configure its own API gateway. So what I've done so far is I've installed this WSO2 API gateway in a Kubernetes environment. And what you get an API operator and a controller which is going to look out for new custom resource definitions. And then when it gets those custom resource definitions, it goes and installs the API gateway resources. It defines like a custom resource definition. If I look at the definition is defined, there's one called apis.wso2.com. And so their custom resource definition basically is very similar to the one we previously created. It basically says there's a resource called an API. It's expecting in its specification things like a name and a scope, and it's got validation using OpenAPI v3 schema validation. So it's expecting like a Swagger definition of your API in the custom resource. I've been just through their example at the moment, and if you follow their example, the example actually creates an API, and this is what you end up with. You end up this is an instance of that custom resource definition. So I've got an instance of an API, and the one in their example is an online store. And so in the online store, it literally says, I have an online store. There's a link to where the API is defined. The actual Swagger is configured into a config map, which is a different resource in Kubernetes. So the API is now up and running. When you run it, it actually builds that the product's deployment is the actual implementation behind the API. When you go and deploy the API, the controller actually configures almost like micro gateways. So there is a job which actually builds a Docker image for your micro gateway, puts it into your Docker repository, and then runs it. So the online store is the API gateway microservice that's fronting this product's deployment, which is the implementation. Yeah. So it actually builds this for you as part of deploying the API. And so if I then go into the developer portal, which is part of the API gateway, I can see my API is being deployed. I can click on this online store API, and this is where it has all the sort of the functionality you'd expect in an API gateway. So it's letting me see the details of the API. It's letting me see the resource endpoints. It's letting me build subscriptions. So basically, I can go and create a token for someone else to get access to the API. And when I grant them the token, that's when I can put things like rate limits and even things like charging for that API. And it's got some other things like generating SDKs and other documentation around the API.